Step into the squared circle, where the bell echoes through decades, where main events become legends and tag teams tore the house down. From the undercard to the top of the card, this is Portland wrestling at its finest. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. This is Ringside in Rose City. And here's your hosts, Frank Culbertson and Mike Rogers.
Hey, thanks, Lisa. That's a great introduction once again. I'm Frank Culbertson, joined as always by Portland wrestling historian
Mike Rogers.
And this is Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, and 1,000 stories, all rooted right here in Portland. Now, on this show, we spend a lot of time digging into the history of Portland wrestling, the wrestlers, the cards, the rivalries, and the way the territory evolved week by week. And sometimes the best way to understand that history is to talk with someone who has spent years studying it, researching it, and helping preserve it. And tonight's guest is someone who has done exactly that. Matt Farmer is one of the most respected wrestling historians working today. His knowledge doesn't just cover the Pacific Northwest. It stretches across the United States and deep into the history of Mexican wrestling as well. He's one of those rare people who has spent countless hours digging through old newspapers, finding results, going through archives and film, trying to piece together the stories behind the matches and the promotions that help shape professional wrestling. And Matt doesn't just study wrestling history, he's lived parts of it as well. He spent time in the ring early in his career, worked behind the scenes in different roles in the business, and today is one of the co-promoters, one of the driving forces behind Defy Wrestling, one of the most successful independent promotions anywhere in the world. So tonight, we're going to be talking to Matt about it all, his work as a wrestling historian, his love of Northwest wrestling history, the process of researching old results in wrestling archives, his time in the ring, and of course, the growth and success of Defy. But first, Lisa, if you would, punch that button and bring Matt Farmer into the Rose City ring with us. Matt, welcome to Ringside in Rose City.
Thank you very much, Frank. First off, before anything else, where do I need to Venmo you for that introduction? Jeez, you put me over. Like, you put me over more than Mike ever has. That's just amazing. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here, guys. Seriously.
So, Mike, what do you think about having Matt on the show tonight? Another historian.
Well, Frank, this is the first time I've really been excited about a historian being on the show because normally I'm the one explaining wrestling history to you. Tonight, Matt and I can finally have a real historian conversation, and you and Lisa can just sit there and take notes. We are taking over the show.
I was just like, we caught up again last year, but it's been a long time since we've really had a chance to talk. And for the people listening, Mike and I have known each other, maybe not as long as Frank and Mike, but geez, I think we met 35 plus years ago in the early 90s.
Early 90s, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Before you started wrestling or before I started reffing?
Yeah, I was a teenager. That's how long ago it was.
It's crazy. So you've spent years researching wrestling history, not just here in the Northwest, but all over. And Matt, in this podcast, we've looked at Portland month by month, starting at the Portland Sports Arena from 1968. And when you examine a promotion like that, you can really learn so many things. What was working, what wasn't working, who was coming in, who was leaving. What aspect of being a wrestling historian do you really enjoy? And what are you trying to constantly to learn about?
Oh, that's a good question. It's interesting. I started really digging into wrestling history basically off of something that you inspired me to do, actually, Mike. So I do got to put you over really quick for that, because reading some of the old Ring Around the Northwest and looking at your results, that really inspired me to dig for myself. I had followed wrestling closely before we met and before I was exposed to the Ring Around the Northwest. And I had started very rudimentary, like seeking out more information, like real information, But after being exposed to you and the Ring Around the Northwest, I really started digging in deeper. And that's when I started taking myself to like the libraries and researching the old microfilms and things like that. But basically, what really interested me early on, it was almost like a puzzle, and I know we've talked about this before. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together where
exactly
you knew a wrestler wrestled in this area during this period of time, but you weren't really sure of how much of that area it encompassed, you know. One of the things that always intrigued me was we knew about the Pacific Northwest and we knew about Portland wrestling, but one of the things that really got me interested was learning about the spot shows, because Portland, Salem, Eugene, that was every week. Everybody knew that. Those results were pretty easy to find. But I knew as a young fan, my first exposure to live pro wrestling was going to spot shows because I lived in Tacoma. So the first events I went to were at the Bicentennial Pavilion in Tacoma, because Don Owen would run once a month, or Dutch Savage would run once a month in Tacoma. And I remember those shows that I went to and just how great they were. They were really good shows. And I just wanted to learn more about them. I was like, well, geez, if they held events here every month, where else did they hold shows at? You would see the calendars every week when Frank Bonema would run down the list of shows, things like that. But you're like, man, they held shows there. There was cards there. It's like, it was like a big puzzle I wanted to put together. And that's really what inspired me to dig in deep and see what was going on in the Northwest.
That's such a great way to put it, that it's a puzzle, because I think I've said exactly that same thing before. When I look at Wrestle Data and, you'll look at the updates of everything they start adding, and I get so excited when there be like, here's a Northwest result, like Longview, and it's like,
yeah,
I have this result, and you'll go through, and somebody obviously went through and took the time and trouble to look through something to find like a series of results from this one town.
I know for Longview, for example, I went down to the state library in Olympia, and down there they would have the Columbian Basin News or whatever, and they would have the results for the monthly Longview cards. I think they were like the first Monday of every month, and I remember being so excited when I came across those. And I didn't research the entire, like probably what you do too, is you pick a decade to start with. And then you kind of want to go in a chronological order just for your own sake,
Right.
I think that I started in the 70s, maybe 71 or 70, and went all the way up until the 80s with Longview. I know I shared some of those with Wrestling Data, but there's a lot of results that I have, and I'm sure that you have, that Wrestling Data I haven't shared with them yet. But it's just like, when I would find something like Longview, and then you would see like other newspapers, and it was great. Longview, for example, that was one of the ones that I was really surprised by. Like, you'd be going through the results, and then you'd be like, oh my gosh, Andre the Giant was here. He wrestled Buddy Rose in a singles match, and they sold the building out, and you'd get like really excited about it.
Oh, that's so funny. Because yeah, exactly. When I was in college, I discovered microfilm and the wrestling results. And I'm spending way, way too much time in that little microfilm room. To be honest, I dropped out of college one term because I spent way too much time in there. That's awful to admit, but at least it turned out good. I eventually graduated, but yeah, it is true. It's like, okay, I want to find out, at 8 years old, I'm aware of what's going on and I'm following wrestling, but it's like, what happened before I'm aware of things, and it's like, to learn that aspect is just as exciting as what you remember and everything.
Yes, very much true. When I was a fan, my grandfather and father were both fans. My grandfather was like a really, really big fan. Like, he watched everything on television before World War II, or even during World War II. He had actually started training to be a pro wrestler in Hawaii, just a few training sessions, but then unfortunately Pearl Harbor was attacked. You might have heard about it, and he was on Pearl Harbor when it was attacked.
Do you remember who he was training with?
I don't, because when he was telling, he passed away back in the early 90s. So unfortunately, when the stories that he told me at that time, I didn't really like put two and two together about asking him who was training. But what's interesting is, I know like yourself and Mark Hewitt and a few others really started researching Hawaii, and I did too, in the 40s. And remember those results about how hot pro wrestling was in Hawaii in the 40s.
Yeah.
And we're talking now, a lot of these cards were free admission for soldiers, but there was that, I forgot what it was called, the Oahu Bowl or something. It's not the Aloha Bowl, which is now the big stadium, but it was like a venue by the Schofield Barracks, I believe the Army base. And it was like a I've seen pictures of it, and it's like a big outdoor amphitheater, and it could hold like 10,000 people.
Wow.
And there were times that they would put 8, 9, 10,000 people in this arena, and a lot of the wrestlers were not well-known wrestlers.
Right.
So I think a lot of the wrestlers were servicemen, and I'm pretty sure it was almost like a semi-pro type league, because you would see some Japanese American wrestlers on there as well, who were probably living on the island already, and had trained a little bit with guys. And so like there weren't a lot of names or even recognizable names in Hawaii at that time. But his training, what he was able to communicate to me, was pretty rudimentary. They would go to a gym and work out. He did have stories about practicing a drop kick, which would have been like a big move at the time,
Sure.
And when he was younger, he would show my parents his drop kick and things like that. So like, it was just something he was interested in. But of course, the war changed everybody's lives at that time.
Oh, wow. That's super interesting.
Yeah. But so like my dad, he used to be an usher at the Tacoma Armory where they held weekly cards. And so he became kind of friendly with a lot of the guys like Gene Kaninsky, for example, because Kaninsky was part of the office for the most part around that time. And he would just tell stories about seeing these different wrestlers. And I was like, oh, I'm not familiar with these guys, or a lot of these names are names that I've seen in results, but don't know a lot about them. What was their story like? And so I would research those guys, and like, I remember meeting like Daniel McDonald, who was like a long-term old wrestler who was working at a mortuary in Tacoma.
Right.
And he would tell me these stories about wrestling and things like that. And then I would like, okay, I got to go research all of these Daniel McDonald matches. Where did he wrestle at? And so that's kind of how things went. You just kind of learn a little bit more, and then something would interest you and you'd be like, oh my gosh, I've got to go research this city now, or that town, or that year, or what was going on, who was the promoter, things like that.
We're going to interview Rocky De La Sera, and I'm doing some prep on him. And it's like looking at the different places he wrestled, and it's like Newfoundland. It's like, did I even realize there was wrestling in Newfoundland? And I find the promotion on Wrestle Data, and it's like, I can't wait, to start researching that small little territory.
Yes. Yeah, it's crazy. That's one of the things I know fans today don't quite grasp, is how large pro wrestling was at one time. It would be harder to name like the countries and islands and places where pro wrestling didn't have some kind of existence than it would be to name all of them that did. Because like in Wrestling Data, you could see all those countries that had wrestling at one time. Recently, me and a friend of mine on a website, we came across some results from Caraco, which is a small island off of Colombia. And these were big name wrestlers that were coming in for short tours, guys like Dusty Rhodes and Sergeant Slaughter and Andre the Giant, Big John Studd. I mean, these were like major names that were coming in to do one shots on an island. And there was 4,000 or 5,000 people.
Wow.
It's really interesting to see things like that.
Yeah. Matt, as someone who's proud of Northwest wrestling history, how did you feel when CM Punk said the phrase Piper in Portland? He was acknowledging what a great run and time where Piper might have done his very best work.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think Piper was at its peak in Portland. It's interesting. I was a big fan of Piper when I was younger. As an adult, not a big fan of Piper. But it's also, in some ways, it's interesting when it comes to Roddy, is that he did have a big effect on Portland, and he was maybe one of the bigger names that came out of Portland. But it's also annoying because there's so much more to Portland than just Piper. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, he was here for a few years and he did make a big impact, but it's like, he wasn't the biggest star in Portland.
No,
maybe for a year or two, he was the biggest star, but for longevity and just year after year drawing crowds, he's probably not even in the top 20,
When I asked that question, it's almost not even about Piper. It's about Punk recognizing the territory and that small little great run in the territory. Piper's the person he mentioned, but it almost doesn't have anything to do with Piper.
Agreed. Yeah. When I seek out great matches from the Northwest, there's a lot of guys that I'm looking for because I know that they're going to be great matches. Somebody like Jay Youngblood or somebody like that, or Rick Martel. It's like, geez, those guys were so great in the territory. It's still like a lot of guys, it's still my favorite place for a lot of wrestlers to have visited.
Yeah.
I want to throw in here, interrupt Mike for just a minute because I have to. And Matt, thanks for trying to put him over. And you made his head even bigger than it normally is, which I don't appreciate. Matt, you have a Piper story that I remember so well when we were doing the WB Studio Wrestling for Portland Wrestling. And the first main event that we had in the studio was the Suicide Kings versus Scotty Mack and Dave Hollenbeck. We had a finish all lined out, and Piper came up at the very end and said, why don't we do this little bit instead? And it was just a little detail, but it made the finish so much better. And so I think that's the thing about Piper that I appreciated was the little details that could really make the difference in how big a story was, as opposed to it was a good story or it was a great story.
Yeah, very much. And, one of the things about Piper that he was very instrumental to me was those little touches like that. But he was also very detailed when it came to protecting yourself. And, there's good and bad sides to that, right? But there were little details that he told me and my partner about protecting ourselves to give that aura. And we were young, so maybe we didn't fully grasp what he was saying at the time, but about protecting yourself and keeping yourself as like a top person. And there's little things you do, like even if the match is going to be short, what do? We were wrestling in a studio, so you wanted to wrestle a little different. You wanted things to be a little snugger, a little tighter. You wanted the matches to be a little less complicated, little things like that, because it was such a small studio wrestling type feature. So he was great about that. I've had a lot of positive interactions with Piper. That night, one of those nights that Piper was there, I remember him working on promos with me and things like that. And one of the scenes was where we were going to slap each other or something like that. And I remember Piper hauling off and slapping me. And I was like, it was only like 2 or 3 people in the room, but I was like, why is this guy hitting me so hard? And he wanted me to slap him back. And after 2 or 3 times slapping me, I just was like, I'm just going to hit this guy as hard as I can. And I didn't, but I slapped the shit out of the guy. It didn't bother him. It's like, hey, that's what I was doing to you. But it was so weird to me that here's a guy who was probably 50 years old at the time, just going over a promo with me and trying to get a lot of that energy out of me and trying to get me worked up to cut this promo. And in doing so, he's willing to put himself in a position to get hit to inspire me to or push me to get motivated for this promo. So those little things like that always have stuck out in my mind.
I'm glad that Matt got to answer that question, but Frank, just sit back because the big boys are talking tonight.
Wow.
I don't remember exactly when I met you, Mike, but I do remember one of my fondest memories as a teenager going to wrestling was myself and my old tag partner, Nick. We would meet up with you at some matches, like at the Portland Sports Arena, and then we would go out to eat some pizza or something afterwards. And I just remember those were so much fun at that time.
That was lots of fun.
Yeah. And I don't remember how we met or who introduced us or anything like that because it's such a long time ago, but it was like really cool to me.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And if we talk about Roddy Piper, you have to talk about Buddy Rose. They just kind of go hand in hand. And I know you were working on a Buddy Rose book. And the last interview that we did, you had put it on hold. Is there any update? And can you talk about being around Buddy and what he meant to the business, especially in Portland?
Yeah, Buddy, Buddy is, there's that old saying, like a lot of people that know Buddy is Buddy, right? Like he's a different kind of a guy. There's like Piper, there's so many different sides to Buddy. He could be, as you know, Mike, like the nicest guy in the world, right?
Right.
He also had like a little dark side to him too, and had his, what they call nowadays, demons and things like that. But as a young fan, when I first started watching wrestling, my first exposure to pro wrestling was Portland wrestling. And Buddy Rose was like my favorite, even though he was a heel at the time. He was the guy that really got me inspired to look into pro wrestling. He's the one that made me the fan that I became 100%. There was nobody else. Of course, there were opponents of his that I liked to watch. There were feuds that I liked to watch, but he was the guy that was always that constant. And as time grew, you learned just how super talented the guy was, just all around, just a great athlete. And yeah, I mean, got to hang around him a little bit when I first started breaking in. And as years grew, he just kind of started trusting me a little more and we became friends. And we had a lot of those late night calls and it just turned into where we became friends, where we were talking almost daily. And, you know, at one point he asked me to write a book for him. So we did record a lot of different passages and things like that. And there was always concern on his part about releasing the book because he felt that like if we kept everything the way we initially wanted it, he would have burnt a lot of bridges because he exposed like a lot of details about pro wrestling and the good and the bad side. And a lot of the things would paint a lot of his friends in bad light. And so, yeah, there was a break there from the time we finished working together on the book. And then when he passed away, and there was like a little bit of a falling out the last like few months of his life. And then a few weeks before he passed away, we kind of mended fences. Because as you know, Buddy could be very temperamental, you know, and there would be periods of time where even if he felt a little bit of slight, like you slighted him in any way, he would cut off conversations with you.
Right.
The last few weeks, we kind of like mended fences and we're talking again about doing the book. But what we wrote down together, it's one of those situations where like I'd probably have to clear it through like a lawyer before releasing the book.
Sure.
I don't know. There was some pushback from his family about the book. And so I don't know if I ever wanted to. There's been times where I'm like, I'll go ahead and release it. But I don't know. It's just one of those things. I don't know if I want to now because he's not here to defend himself.
Sure. The one thing that Buddy has such, like you mentioned, different sides to him. The very, very, very first thing he ever said to me when we were introduced was, I will never do an interview for you. I said, that's fine. But we got to be pretty good friends as well. And one of the humorous stories that I have is we were, Ed and Dale and Buddy and his wife, Tammy, and I were in Las Vegas in Cauliflower Alley. And we were going to take a cab ride to a really great buffet. Got in the cab and it was about a 15-minute ride. And we got out, had our buffet, got back in the cab. And on the way back, it was like literally a 2-minute ride back to where we started.
Oh,
we all realized that the first cab ride had worked us. And like Ed and I are kind of laughing about it. And Buddy is just like beside himself. He's like, don't ever tell this story because he's just embarrassed.
Yeah.
You know? And we would have these conversations about different people and how talented they were. And Buddy would take the interesting position that anybody could do what he does. Like you could take the greenest wrestler, and if you just give him wins and give him time, that wrestler would be as popular as Buddy was. And I said, you know, I took the position that, yes, but as you get more experience, you are better. And I'm actually arguing with Buddy about how good Buddy is. And you know, he knows he's good, but he's taking the position that anybody could do what he did. So it's real. And you know that Buddy had confidence, you know, he had pride, but it was just really interesting for him to take that position where we're actually having a discussion about how good he is. And he's saying, no, anybody could do this.
Yeah, I do think that he felt that if a promotion got behind somebody and pushed them, they could be a big star, no matter, because there's a lot of evidence to support that, right? I mean, there's a lot of wrestlers out there that skill-wise weren't that great that became box office attractions, right?
Sure.
And somebody like Buddy, because he is so confident in his ability, would be able to work with that person and put them over and make them look like they were world beaters, because he's done that before himself. But yeah, that was a conversation that I had. It's strange. Buddy had a lot of confidence in himself and was I think maybe even a deterrent to his own career about how good he actually was. I think that was almost a crutch because he was so darn good that it kept him from maybe keeping himself in better condition and better shape, because even at his worst shape, he was still like one of the best. And I think that did hold him back in some ways. But yeah, he was tremendous. But yeah, I agree. That does sound a lot like Buddy.
We just interviewed the grappler, and he talked about Buddy coming in when Len got the book, and that Buddy just wanted to be able to give ideas and not take over. Grappler said, of course, that he could give his ideas because Buddy always had great ideas. How smart was Buddy in getting the storylines over?
I mean, yeah, in that situation, I would almost guarantee that was Buddy's way of getting Len to put his guard down to take over.
That's classic.
And maybe Grappler knew that, right?
Sure.
And I'm sure that's what Grappler knew. He wasn't dummy. He was smart. But I mean, look, that would be Buddy's MO, right? Like, come in, hey, I'm your pal. I just want to give you some ideas. But for storytelling, geez, Buddy's tremendous. If you're exposed to guys like Kurt Hennig or Shawn Michaels, and they tell you a story, and the story starts with, this is how Buddy would do it, then you know that Buddy has that talent, right? Because that was something that Shawn would say and Kurt would say. The few times that I was around Kurt, I heard him say, this is what Buddy would do, or this is how Buddy would do it, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's just a huge tip of the cap. Right. His storytelling abilities is like upper echelon, right? So yeah, he's just a master at it.
I always remember, and I always tell this story because it's the best example of Buddy. It's when he was feuding with Adrian Adonis. They have a loser leave town match set up for Tuesday, but they're wrestling on Saturday on TV to kind of fuel that feud. And Buddy loses 2 straight falls, which never happens on, ever. Like in the history of Portland wrestling, that never happened. And so he loses 2 straight to Adrian, and now they go into a loser leave town match for Tuesday night. Everybody's got confidence in Adonis that he's going to win this loser leave town match. And that's Buddy's idea.
Yeah, that's Buddy 101. One thing that's interesting about, he was never scared about putting somebody over. And that was almost one of his biggest, like, one of his, that was like probably one of Buddy's best, like, qualities about him was his ability to put people over. And, I'm sure the night that he beat, but he sent Adrian home, I bet he put him over to the point where in a year, Adrian could come back and be a top star again.
Oh, sure.
Because Buddy understood that idea of, this is a weekly territory. We have to keep moving. This story has to keep progressing. The only way we're going to be able to do it at this level is to give and take. Right. But yeah, that's Buddy for sure. Interesting that you talked about the 2 out of 3 falls matches. I remember Buddy telling me a story about, after a while, he went to Don. Him and I believe Ed Wiskowski went to Don, and they were like, hey, Don, we got to stop doing these 2 out of 3 fall matches because it was just wearing them out, coming up with that many finishes every week.
Sure.
Because they were doing 2 out of 3 falls matches at spot shows too. And so it was like, yeah, Don, let's just stop doing. And I don't remember exactly what time they stopped doing the 2 out of 3 falls matches, but there was definitely a time when no longer the norm.
Right.
I think it was 83 or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. Did Buddy, and this isn't one of the questions that I have written down, but did Buddy ever talk about his first week in? Because his first week in, he's inserted into a main event, and that never happened in Portland. And Buddy hadn't developed his name yet when he's come to Portland. He's wrestled as Paul Pershman. He's in preliminaries. And to get the push from day one, where he hadn't proved himself in the different territories, that's, and a lot of speculation here. I think that, and I could be way off, but I think Red Bastien probably put a word in for him. And I bet that Don just took that word and just gave him the ball and let him run with it.
Yes. That like Red and Don were close.
Yeah.
They were good friends. And in some ways, Red came in the late 70s for like a short run.
Right.
And my understanding was that he actually came in to help book.
Really?
Because there was many conversations where Buddy would talk to Red about the finish and Red would go over the finishes with everybody. And I don't know if he was actually like, if he had the title of booker, but he definitely came in to help Don with some ideas. But Don and Red were such good friends that Buddy told me that Red was the one that put in the call to Don to bring in Buddy.
Sure.
And he talked with Buddy for weeks about his image. He helped Buddy go and get a robe made. And Ada Johnson, The Rock's mom, was the one that made that first robe of his.
Oh, wow.
And Terry Funk, who was in Amarillo, Texas at the time.
Yes.
Or had come because Buddy had been working for Fritz, but he had also made some shots in Amarillo too.
Uh-huh.
And Terry was the one that gave him the name Buddy Rose.
I had heard this before.
Yes. And I believe Terry got the name from the guy Buddy Rosen, who also worked as Buddy Rogers Jr. a few times in Mexico and like southern Texas, like Juarez and El Paso.
Uh-huh.
I believe Terry, he told me that Terry was the one that gave him the name. Red got him booked, and Red put him over to Don so strongly because Buddy, those last few months in Texas was really starting to get, not, I wouldn't say get over, but he was really starting to gain a lot of experience and gain a lot of respect. You know, as a matter, you know, he was the one that Fritz chose to work with Kevin Von Erich and help train him. So obviously, if he was only in the business for 2 years, he had to have been looked at pretty highly to be given the task of helping train the promoter's son.
Sure.
So there was a lot of confidence in him already. One story that Buddy did share with me, he drove to Portland and he had no idea what to experience. And Dallas wasn't like the biggest territory, right? But it was still like a pretty established territory.
Sure.
And Buddy had worked some big cards. Like that summer, he worked the Texas Stadium show, for example. So he had been exposed to some bigger buildings. And, you know, besides the Sportatorium, they would run in Fort Worth at the Northside Coliseum. So those weren't like the biggest venues, but he had been exposed to some bigger places and he was doing okay in Texas. I think he told me he was averaging $400 a week in 1976. So that's okay money at the time.
Sure.
But he drove to Portland, and the first night he got there like Saturday morning. And the first night he went to the Portland Sports Arena. And now this is something that I've always kind of like, I wish I would have asked Buddy when he was alive, but I remember coming across a result of Buddy where he actually, in a small spot show in Willamette, like high school or something like that, the day before the Sports Arena show, and the card is Buddy Rose on that the night before, like Friday night, right?
Oh, super interesting.
So there's like an actual clipping of a match, but I don't have the results for it. Did Buddy actually appear on that show?
Right.
But it actually, you know, I have the clipping of Buddy appearing the night before the Sports Arena card. I don't know if he actually made that show or not, because when he told me his first night was at the Sports Arena.
Uh-huh.
Of course, he could have been mistaken, but who knows?
Sure.
But he said he pulled up to the Sports Arena and he met with Jesse Ventura, who he had known from Minneapolis. And he explained to me that Jesse was one of those type of wrestlers that even though he was only a year older than Buddy, he would call Buddy Kid. And he had even I believe he'd broken into the business like around the same time or maybe a little after Buddy. But he'd call Buddy Kid, and they got the finish, and from the get-go, they were getting ready to put over Buddy. And they went over that night, and I believe they won the tag titles that night, right?
I don't think they won the tag titles, but he was certainly in the mix right from day one.
Yeah, you're right. They might not have won it that night, but they might have won it the week later.
Yeah.
But right away, they were put in on top.
Right.
But he went into Portland that night. He couldn't believe it when he got to the building, because the Portland Sports Arena, from the outside looking in, it's not very fancy looking. It's just a rundown old bowling alley.
Yeah.
And it's a good crowd and everything, but it's in August, so I'm sure the house wasn't that great because, you know, August in the Portland Sports Arena, they never really drew great.
Right.
Unless it was a hot program or something. But they'd usually cool it down in August because of the heat and everything. But the thing that he always told me about that first night is he got his money that night. And when he first pulled up, he was extremely skeptical. He's like, I'm not going to be able to make any money in this place. Because, old wrestlers from that generation, that's the thing that they would talk about was the money.
Right.
But that night he worked the main event and he got $325, which August of 1976, that's a good amount of money.
Yeah.
A lot of Americans didn't make that much money every week in 1976. And the previous territory, he was averaging $400 a week. So he was like, oh my gosh, this is one night. 2 nights later, he jumped in a car with Jesse. He said it was Jesse and Bull Ramos. And they were driving to Yakima, Washington, which is a weekly spot show in a 700-seat auditorium. And they never drew great. It was never like a big money spot show. And he said, the first thing Jesse told me, he said, kid, you're going to get $25 tonight. And that's exactly what they got, $25, because I guess Yakima was a $25 a night town. He was like so upset. But then he said, he thought about it. And he's like, wait a second. I've already made $350 this week. I'm booked 5 more days this week. It's like, even if I average $25 the rest of the shots, I'm going to be doing better than I was doing in Dallas.
Sure.
That's the story I have of Buddy's first week in the territory, right?
Yeah.
I think he ended up clearing, he told me he ended up clearing like $700 and something dollars. I have it written down somewhere, but it's like $700 or $800 for that first weekend.
Wow.
And so he was elated, right? Because that's good money in 1976.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Matt, if you can choose a time period in the Northwest wrestling history that you really enjoy looking at, and maybe it's a little underrated or not recognized at how good it was right there. Is there a time period that you can think of?
I'm fascinated by the 30s, 1930s, but I also think the time period where I think is the coolest might have been the 1960s, because Don Owen in Portland was doing really good, right? That territory was doing really well. A lot of big names, Lonnie May, Tony Bourne. They were hitting on all cylinders. They were drawing great crowds. But then you also had Harry Elliott in Seattle, who had a very strong promotion. You had Rod Fenton in Vancouver, also doing very good at the time. And so just looking at the Northwest as a whole and seeing how there was 3 really strong territories and just how many live events were going on between those 3 areas at any given week, it's amazing. And people, it's hard, like this generation today, it's hard for them to comprehend just how many live events were taking place every single week between Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. A minimum of 3 events a day, if not more, because there were a lot of times they were doing double shots.
And it's hard people understand the Vancouver and people understand Portland, but it's, even for me, it was for a long, long period of time, it was a little unclear of exactly how Harry Elliott fit into that situation.
Yeah. Harry was a very successful promoter in Seattle. Well, he got the television contract in Seattle, so he controlled Washington.
Right.
Because his television was able to reach most of the major markets in Washington. You had Don Owen, you had Rod Fenton on both sides of him. Well, of course he would book the talent from those offices. So those offices would have to double up their crew for the first half of like the 19, and this is another thing that intrigues me about the 60s, is the first half of the 1960s. It's pretty obvious that 90% of the crew that Harry is using is booked out of the Portland office up until the early 60s, I would say. And then there was like a dramatic shift where he pretty much stopped booking a lot of talent from the Portland office and only booked talent from the Vancouver office. There were guys like local homesteaders or whatever who would work all the shows. You had your guys like Daniel McDonald and like Ivan Kameroff and things like that who would just take bookings because they were living here. But the Seattle shows, you'd always get like a really weird mix of wrestlers because of where Harry chose to book talent from. And I believe that break happened because of a personal relationship between Harry and Don Owen falling apart. And it's interesting because they were partners, but there was a 10-year period where Harry Elliott did not speak to Don Owen.
Wow.
And refused to talk to him.
Wow.
But they're partners, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, and there were times when Harry would run shows in Southern Washington that were at times Don's towns, but he would still run the towns. A place like Longview, for example, in the early 60s, sometimes Harry would run it, and then you would have Tony Bourne running spot shows for Don Owen. So it was really a really weird mix. And I've never been able to quite get like Dean Silverstone. I was never quite able to get like Dean to elaborate on why they were able at times to cross promote like that. I guess it's probably just a gentleman's agreement in some ways. Don was getting cut from everything. There's probably a high likelihood that Don was getting a cut of everything that was going on in Vancouver too.
Right.
Because I've always heard that Don was able to have some kind of say in who was running the show up in Vancouver. So
interesting.
Who knows? Yeah. It's all behind the doors, closed discussions.
Right.
So
it's interesting.
Yeah, that's
interesting to think a town like Longview and almost like it's a promotional war with the same promotion.
Yeah. Well, there's that really interesting story that Dean Silverstone told me about a time when he was running spot shows for Harry Elliott. And one of the towns that he chose to run was Chehalis, Washington. And Chehalis is an interesting town because it would receive the television from Seattle, but it would also receive the television from Portland. In those days, if you lived in Seattle, you usually didn't see the television in Portland. You would see sometimes the television from Vancouver, but in Chehalis, because it's farther down south, they got television from both territories. Sandy Barr had come up to help. He came up with a crew, I believe Dean told me, 3 wrestlers from the Portland office. And Dean came down with 3 wrestlers from the Vancouver office. There was some kind of an argument between Sandy and Dean about who was going over that night because the television for Don ran in Chehalis and the television for Vancouver ran in.
Attention to detail by 2 different people,
Yes.
That's a great setup.
And I guess the way they ended up getting it worked out was that Dean, because it was Dean's town, it was actually Harry's town, and Dean was, promoting it for Dean, decided to put Sandy's boys and Don's boys all under masks. So that way they could all do the job, right? And that was how they got around that issue. But, so even though they're partners, they were still like, they were like partners, but they also had the little bit of heat between them too. So, yeah.
Oh, super interesting.
Yeah.
If you can think of any wrestlers in Northwest history, what underrated wrestlers did you see wrestling here and then always wish there was always kind of a pecking order and you always would kind of see how they were going to fall into the pecking order? Was there ever any wrestlers that come to mind that you would have liked to have seen spend more time or get a bigger role? And just an example for me, if I had to answer this question, it would have been Gino Hernandez and Tully Blanchard. I would have loved to have seen what they really could have done given the chance.
Yeah, those are guys that I would have popped into my mind too. Rick McCord would have been another one, Austin Idol, because to see what he became, like if he would have been getting a little more time to get on the mic and battle, I think that would have been really cool. Nobody that pops into my mind. There's wrestlers that I wish would have came to Portland that I would have loved to have seen had a run in Portland. But I think a lot of the talent that did have like a short run here, they were pretty green. So like even like a Magnum TA, I would have loved to see in Portland 2 years later,
Right. Right.
But, when him and Tonga John were in Portland, they were both really inexperienced, so. But yeah, I agree with Tully and Gino. That would have been great to see them.
One show we did was kind of fantasy, thinking about who would have been great if they had come here. And the one wrestler that I really wish would have come here would have been Joe Sladuke.
Oh, that would have been great. Who my wish to have come to Portland was Jerry Lawler.
Sure.
We were talking about Buddy Rose earlier. that was like one of my dream matches, was like Buddy Rose versus Jerry Lawler. And I remember telling Buddy this one time, and he was like, oh, I never thought about going to Memphis because I always heard it was some bad paying territory and stuff like that. And I was like, well, if you were working Lawler, it wasn't. And fun fact is, like, Buddy had never really seen Jerry Lawler wrestle. As much as he was a big tape trading fan and got tons of TV and tapes and stuff, he had never really been exposed to Jerry Lawler. And so one time, Buddy came to visit me at my house in Tacoma, and we were hanging out, and I put on Jerry Lawler versus Bill Dundee Lizard League Town match, which is a really famous match from Memphis. Buddy was just amazed because he knew Bill Dundee a little bit, but he wasn't really familiar with like Lawler's work. And I was like, yeah, you and Lawler would have like drawn some huge money.
Sure.
And he was just watching that, and he was just like, that was awesome. He was like, that match is awesome. And then he bought into what I was saying, like that him and Lawler could have drawn some money together. And it's like, I always wish like Buddy would have went to Memphis also.
Yeah.
That was always one of my wishes, is that Jerry would have came to Portland.
Yeah.
Another guy too is Hulk Hogan. Buddy told me a story about how Hogan was supposed to come here for like a one-shot deal in 82, I believe.
Right.
And they were almost ready to announce it and everything. And that would have been really cool too.
And they were dancing around it. When Dizzy Hogan was here, when Brutus was here, they kept dancing around it. And we were expecting that he was going to be announced.
Yeah. Well, he told me how much they were going to pay him for the one shot too. They were going to pay him $1,000.
Wow.
And that's how far they'd gone into their negotiations. And Buddy had actually become friends with Hulk on one of the tours for New Japan. And so Buddy was like pushing it because he wanted to work Hulk.
Sure.
So,
J. Michael Kenyon was somewhat of a mentor to both of us. And I found him a little intimidating at times, but obviously he knew more about wrestling than just about anyone. Do you have any good J. Michael Kenyon stories?
It's interesting that you asked that because Steve Johnson is working on a book about J. Michael right now. And so he was asking me some questions about Jay. And I felt the same way. I was super intimidated by him. One of the things I just shared with Steve is like J. Michael Kenyon shared the very first card that he ever went to live, which was at the old Seattle Civic Auditorium. And the main event was Lou Thesz versus Primo Carnera from 1952.
Wow.
And I'm just like thinking, here's a guy that I'm talking to that was like a mentor to me, who we both love wrestling history. And it's like, here's a guy I'm talking to that I'm learning from. His first main event was literally like from a different 2, 3, 4 generations back.
Right.
Here's Lou Thesz and Primo Carnera who go back to the 30s, right? And it's like so interesting that here are two guys, this is the first match that he's ever seen live. And yeah, it's just so intriguing. But I can't pinpoint one story. He used to share so much advice with me. I guess there was one story. I remember myself and Nick were running some shows in Bellevue, Washington. We were kind of like helping promote the shows. And we were also booking the shows. I invited J. Michael Kenyon to come to the show. And so he came and just chatted with everybody and talked to everybody. And Nick and I went to the ring, and of course we put ourselves in the main event, right? Like as you do. So we're wrestling, and after the match, I'm sitting there with J. Michael, and I'm just talking to him about it. And I was like, so what'd you think? And of course he tells me what he's thinking, and he just gave me some advice. He's like, when you go to the ring, try to make eye contact with some fans in the front row. Or he's like, walk to the ring, make eye contact, but you want to come across like you have like an air of superiority to them. Like, you're almost better than them. As a heel, this was advice he was giving to me as a heel. Come out to the ring and just put yourself in a different, make yourself look like they're beneath you when you look at them. And that was something that always stuck out in my mind. He was also like, I kind of like moved fast to the ring. And he said to like, take your time because it's a spot show. It's not television. You want to take your time so that way you could build that quick relationship with a fan. And so that was something that always stuck out in my head.
And that detail like that is just something that's lost in today's wrestling.
100%. And I was talking to a few of the younger wrestlers that night, actually, and they were asking me about this old man that was telling me some things to do. And I was like, this is a guy who's like traveled with like Lou Thez, right? Because Michael and Lou were like great friends. So by me telling these younger guys that, I was like, this guy has been around the block. He's learned things just through osmosis by hanging around somebody like a Lou Thez, right? So like, you better take his advice.
Frank,
Yes, Lisa.
it's that time.
Yeah. Mike, you hear that music. Matt, I know you never miss a single episode of Ringside in Rose City, so you know what that music means. It's your favorite part of the show, and you know it's time for kayfabe curveballs, where trivia and reality blur. Lisa's going to hand me 3 questions. They could be wrestling related. At least one always will be, but we'll see how much Mike knows about stuff outside of wrestling. Okay, Lisa, hand me tonight's questions, please.
Here you go.
Thank you. Okay, Mike, listen to this.
Debbie, now that you've tasted Aunt Jemima's brand new syrup, do you have any questions?
Yes. Aunt Jemima, what took you so long?
At last, the First Lady of Pancakes makes a syrup of her own. She put it in a modern beaker with a handy handle and a drip-proof spout. If you love Aunt Jemima's pancakes, wait until you taste them with her new syrup.
Aunt Jemima, what took you so long?
I love me some maple syrup on my pancakes. And that was an Aunt Jemima commercial from 1967. And Mike, you recently were in a trivia contest about maple syrup, where you correctly identified the main producers of maple syrup in the United States. Not surprisingly, all were in the Northeast portion of the United States. There was Vermont, New York, Maine, all in the Northeast. So that makes sense. But it wouldn't be right for me to ask you about producers since you already know that. But your question, Mike, is what state has the highest average retail cost per gallon of maple syrup for someone to purchase some of that maple syrup made in Vermont, New York, and Maine?
Oh. Hey, Mike, let me interrupt. It's weird. Like, I don't know a lot about maple syrup, but I actually think I know the answer to this question. The answer, New Hampshire. I believe it's like, what, $52.20 per gallon?
That is correct. How did you know that?
I just happened to be reading about it this morning, and I came across an article in the magazine.
Wow,
That's amazing.
New York is
Yeah.
second at $37.60, but you're correct, $52.20 per gallon. Now, I would have thought it was somewhere else, like on the West Coast, but no, it is actually right there where it is produced. It's the most expensive. That's insane.
Thought it was like, I would have thought it was Florida or something like that.
Yeah, or maybe Hawaii, a long ways away.
Yeah.
But, okay, Mike, we got another question
Sorry,
here.
sorry to interrupt too, Mike.
No, that's
okay.
absolutely fine.
Okay, Mike, listen to this clue.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America is asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. On a highway or a road along a levee. Performance is sweeter, nothing can beat her. Life is completer in a Chevy. So make a date today to see the USA and see it in your Chevrolet.
Traveling east, traveling west, wherever you go, Chevy service is best. Southward or north, near place or far, there's a Chevrolet dealer for your Chevrolet car.
So make a date today to see the USA and see it in your Chevrolet.
Yes, that's Dinah Shore from 1953, encouraging us to see the USA in our Chevrolet. Road trips. I love road trips. And Mike, you recently took a road trip to Texas, didn't you?
Yes.
So here's a question about Texas. What is the maximum speed limit in Texas, and on what highway is that on? And I want to mention that Mike is not known for driving fast, as Ricky Morton will attest to, and as I will attest to. Mike's speed limit is about 35. But Mike, answer the question.
Well, let's see here.
Hey,
I'm gonna-
Mike.
Yeah.
It's so
What
funny,
a
but
rib.
like last week I was actually in Texas, and I was driving down the road because I was helping some guys run a show down there last weekend, and I was actually driving between Austin and San Antonio. So the answer is actually 85 miles an hour on the State Highway 130.
What? That is
Yes.
100% correct.
Really?
Wow, Matt, I'm so glad that you're here to help Mike out.
I had actually I was kind of caught off guard when I saw 85 miles an hour because I was like, that's extremely fast, right? Like, why the heck are they allowing people to drive that fast? But it's a long stretch. It's nice and straight and it's flat. So, hey, it's pretty safe, I guess.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm glad Matt is here to help you out, Mike.
Did Mike, I apologize. Did you know the answer?
No, not really. Our bus wouldn't go with 5, so
okay.
I was a little unaware.
Okay. Mike, we'll give you one final chance here, one final clue, so listen to this.
I've Got a Secret, presented by Winston, the cigarette that changed America's mind about filter smoking. Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should. Now, Winston Filter Cigarettes bring you America's #1 panel show, I've Got a Secret, starring Gary Moore.
Yes, Mike, that's the opening to the classic TV game show, I've Got a Secret. Back in the good old days when cigarette ads were everywhere and could promote the show. In fact, while the show exposed the guest secrets, sometimes it's good to keep a secret and not expose the guest secret. In fact, while reffing one time, you exposed a secret during the match, didn't you? Mike, is that true or false?
Hold on. I know this one for sure, Mike. Okay, so like one time, get this right. Mr. Historian over here, Mike Rogers, he was refereeing one time when I was wrestling as the Inferno. I was a heel wearing a mask, and being that Mike and I go long ways back, I kept pulling my opponent's hair. Well, Mike, being the historian kept saying, Matt, quit pulling the hair. Matt, quit pulling the hair. 3 or 4 times while he's counting 1, 2, 3. Get your hands off the hair, Matt. And I'm just like, oh my, look at this guy exposing the business.
Wow.
Come on, Mike.
Wow.
I thought you knew better.
Is
that the story you were thinking?
Yeah, it's so true. It's like, Matt, get out of the hair, Matt. What are you doing, Matt? I must have called him Matt 10 times in a space of like 20 seconds. And he's going like, he's getting so mad. And I'm like, clueless.
Oh, there's something that we hear from Mike all the time. He's clueless.
Yeah. You know, there is another story did Mike ever tell you about the time he was a wrestler?
No, I've heard that he was in a battle royal once.
It was, and I just happened to be in that battle royal too. I don't remember exactly what set it up, but Mike, some point of the battle royal, like ripped off his referee shirt and just started growling at wrestlers. And then I think he locked up with this wrestler, Mike Jones, who was unorthodox, let's say that.
Coach Mike Jones.
Yes, Coach Mike Jones, which, you know, as a first-time match is somebody you probably would not want to have as your first match. But I just remember the growl that Mike was letting out.
What I remember is and I don't know why or how this came about, I started lighting Nick up with English-style uppercuts.
Yes.
And at the end, I'm like, I'm so sorry, Nick. And Nick is so sheepish. He's like, oh, no problem. And I know that I just rocked him.
You were probably like, I'll go to Nick because he's about my size.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like Samito will get mad at me.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, these are great stories. And it's always good that Mike gets someone here to help him out because really, Mike sometimes gets 1 out of the 3 questions, but it's good to see him get 3 out of 3 with the help of historian Matt Farmer. And this has been Kayfabe Curveballs, where reality and trivia blur. But it's time to go back to the Portland wrestling questions that we've got for Matt. And I've got one for you, Matt. You've talked about how you got interested in wrestling from your grandfathers, and that was my interest in Portland wrestling as well. But how did you go from that interest to getting actually involved in wrestling and becoming a wrestler?
There's not like a definitive answer to that, actually. I think growing up, there was always like that little thing in the back of your head that, hey, I'd like to be a wrestler. That'd be fun. And I had wrestled in amateur and all that good stuff growing up. I kind of liked fighting and everything like that when I was a kid and do the backyard pro wrestling. But it was really different at that time. this was still before like the internet. So like wrestling schools and things like that weren't advertised, like there were some schools here or there, and there was never anything in the Northwest. And the Northwest was like, you guys know this, like 10 years behind the rest of the country. Like I wanted to wrestle. My friend Nick and we talked about it, and we started going to matches together, like everywhere, like all across the state and wherever we could get to. We would just drive. As soon as we got our driver's license, we would go to shows. And I remember my buddy Nick, who's a little shorter, we saw Buddy Wayne wrestle, and Nick was like, oh my gosh, I'm like the same size as this guy. Before that, your perception, your idea in your head is like, these guys are all big. You had to be like really big to get into pro wrestling. And like a lot of the local promotions, like Sandy Bar at the time was running. And he was using only big jacked up guys from the gym who were like 6'3" and bigger. There wasn't like really an end. Like, how do you get involved in wrestling really? So we would just hang around the shows as fans and just going to everything that we possibly could get into. And then we came across this wrestler or promoter at the time, Dave DeBashi, and he was like, hey, I could help you kind of get trained. And so we were like, okay, that sounds fun. And to be honest, our intentions of wrestling was just like to have a match. We didn't have these grand ideas about going to WWE or becoming stars or anything, because I didn't really know that was like a achievable thing at all. It was more about just getting out there and having fun and doing something cool. To be honest, my goal when I got into wrestling was to wrestle at the Portland Sports Arena and to wrestle at Cloverdale, which in the early 90s was really hot at the time. So when I was sneaking across the border before I was 18 or whatever to go to shows there was a really cool spot. And so that was my dream of being able to wrestle in those facilities. And that's all I wanted to do at the time.
So I want to ask one more question. I know Mike's got a couple more, what he wants to talk about, Defy and stuff, but I know that I've seen some pictures of you wrestling Matt Bourne in a pretty bloody affair. What was it like wrestling Matt Bourne? Because Grappler has talked about how sometimes it was really a fight in the ring and sometimes it was just a work.
Yeah, Matt, it's interesting. Like I had wrestled Matt before that a few years, 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years before that actually, like in the 90s for ECCW up in Canada. And I always got along really well with Matt Bourne. And whatever the reason was, is he liked me too. And so I never had a problem with Matt. He was stiff at times, but I could be too at the time, so that didn't bother me at all. Wrestling Matt, especially like those times in Oregon and things like that I did wrestle Matt, was always like so much fun to me, because we would do a thing where we wouldn't talk before the match. And a matter of fact, like we were in separate parts of the building, so we didn't even talk before the match. So that was always a lot of fun. Matt's another guy like Buddy Rose where he's got multiple sides to him. But for me personally, like I always got along great with Matt. He always treated me really well. And it's strange, like a lot of my experiences with like a lot of the wrestlers that I grew up watching, like Matt Bourne and Buddy Rose, Colonel De Beers, me and Mike Miller, Grappler, Top Gun, all of those, like Billy Tweagles, all of those guys. Like I always, even Billy Jack Haynes, I've had like really good experiences with those guys. But at the same time, I knew many of them, not all of them, but some of them had like a dark side too. But with Matt, I always got along with him really well and went on some tours with Matt, and he just liked me a lot. So all of my experiences with him are very positive.
Great. Okay, Mike, back to you.
We touched on this in the last print interview that we did for the book, and you had mentioned that you had worked for an agent for different groups. In fact, you mentioned one summer you worked for 5 different groups. And I neglected to ask, what were some of the groups that you worked for?
Well, at the time, I had done some work for, like, I believe that summer, not only was I working at Defy, but I had done some work for Ring of Honor, MLW, New Japan, and Master Republic, who had run some shows. They're based out of California. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've had the opportunity to work in different positions for different companies. And it's always fun to be able to dip your toes and to work along other people and learn a little bit from everybody. Yeah, it's always interesting because there's times that I actually enjoy more of that other side of pro wrestling more than I like the in-ring stuff. It just depends on the situation,
Sure. In our last interview update we did, you had started talking about Defy and the promotion that you've worked on. How did you come up with the name Defy?
That was actually my partner and the founder of the company, Jim Perry. He had the initial concept of Defy, and then we met and we started talking, and this would have been in like 2016. We started talking about some of our different ideas and goals of pro wrestling and concepts, and we just realized that we were very in tune with a lot of our ideas. Now, he was coming from a background of like marketing, commercials, advertising, and things like that. So his background wasn't necessarily pro wrestling, but a lot of our ideas for pro wrestling meshed and went hand in hand. One of our goals with Defy when we first started was we wanted to do something different. Pro wrestling at the time in the Northwest was a little archaic, maybe. We wanted to come in with something completely different. We wanted to lean into more of like a punk, if you were attending a concert, for example, like that kind of a feeling, that kind of an atmosphere. And that generation, we noticed like globally pro wrestling was changing in how the presentation was done. That's why, like, when you look at like a lot of those early Defy events, they're almost cinematic in a lot of ways. Not cinematic in like how like WWE's done like cinema style matches, but cinematic in how it was shot and presented, and some of the camera angles, and just how we directed everything was a little different. And it's really interesting now as we see national companies who have, and they've admitted to this, not only just publicly, but privately as well. There's things as far as how they've advertised their events and how they've shot things that they took directly from Defy, which is pretty mind-boggling, but it's something that's pretty common, and like you can see it today in people's product. It was just something that had always been on my mind. I always felt that I had made this mistake too, as somebody who had promoted events in the past, where you'd rent like a gymnasium or something and you just put a ring together, put it in the middle of the gymnasium, stack up some chairs, and that's your show, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It can be fun, but I felt like there was like another level to it that you could add in. You could add some lights, you could add in some smoke, you could add a little different feel. Like when we started, we chose not to have like a ring announcer that was in a suit and tie. We brought in a DJ from the local rock station who was just wearing a t-shirt and jeans. And it was just a different feel on 21 and over. So it's like a punk rock crowd, like show almost. It was just like something completely different that wasn't being exposed to like most wrestling in the United States at the time. So yeah, it was just an idea that we had that we wanted to see if it worked.
My next question, you kind of started to get into it. You had mentioned that Defy was different by design. This question is trying to define exactly what makes it different, and also then on the talent that you use. So we've seen other promotions come and go with boatloads of talent, and then they find out that the payoffs for this great talent eats into the profit. I know it's a balance that not very many promotions who deal with that talent can calculate. And obviously, Defy has figured out the formula of how to bring in top talent and then keep your promotion sustainable.
It's a challenge. One of the first big challenges that we had when the concept of Defy first started is we wanted to bring in national talent, because that was something that wasn't exposed. There wasn't a lot of exposure in the Northwest to a lot of national talent. One of the things about Defy too is there was a resurgence at that time taking place slowly in the independent wrestling market at the time. And I think a lot of it has to do with the advent of social media and YouTube, because those two pieces of social media started growing so much that fans in the Northwest and all around the world were being exposed to these different wrestlers. So you would have wrestlers like a Shane Strickland who were, you didn't know who they were. You had access to see who they were before we brought them in. We would bring in a guy like a Shane Strickland, Swerve Strickland. We would bring him in, and there wasn't a lot of exposure nationally to him. There was a lot of exposure to Cody Rhodes because he just left WWE and he was just making a name for himself on the independent scene. And so it was like, let's bring in these two guys. We would look for guys who we thought had a lot of potential we could build as well. But one of the biggest challenges that we had at that time was finding local talent who, for better or less, like, just to cut to the chase, local talent that could hang with like the best of the best in the national talent, you know?
Exactly.
Like there was a lot of great national talent out there, like the independent scene, because companies like Ring of Honor and PWG were so hot. There was a lot of great talent nationally and internationally that weren't exposed to the Northwest. And there were only a handful of guys locally that could hang at that level. And so it was finding that great mix of local talent who could hang and national talent that you thought had potential to be big stars. And of course, you would negotiate their fees and wages and things like that and try to work on a budget that would make sense and you could make a profit off of. So it's always been about that. We've always looked for young talent that we think have a lot of potential to be big stars. And those were the ones that we've always tried to hitch our wagon to.
Before the last time we talked, I compared Defy to Pro Wrestling Guerrilla only for the fact that you just wouldn't know what great stars were going to be on the cards from month to month. And that's something a sense that I've really gotten from Defy.
Yeah.
To be specific here, you mentioned that on one show you had Eddie Kingston. He was scheduled to appear and then got injured, and his replacement was John Moxley. How rewarding is it for you to have a moment when you know you're going to disappoint your audience, but then the replacement that you've lined up is bigger than the advertised match? Like how rewarding is that?
It's immensely rewarding. And to build that relationship with somebody like a John Moxley to where he wants to continue coming back, that means the world to us. But it's also how we treat the talent. It's also how our fans treat the talent. And a lot of it has to do with the community that we've helped build with the local wrestling scene. Wrestling comes in waves, and there was a period of time, we all know this because we've all been fans, where the number of people that would go to a wrestling show, the fan base has dropped, or maybe they've aged out, right? Mm-hmm. For a long time, the Northwest wrestling fans had aged out. There was no longer young fans that were fans of wrestling. They were the same fans that were fans from the 1980s. And we knew that in order to be successful, we had to build a new fan base. And that was one of the things why we decided to go in a completely different direction. A lot of that, I do want to say, has to do with being like a wrestling historian, because I think in order to understand the business as a whole, you need to be able to understand the business in its full, like in its history, and realize that styles change in pro wrestling, fans change in pro wrestling. It's like that old story where George Hackenschmidt was interviewed in the 1930s, and he knocked the wrestlers for not being like real wrestlers in the 1930s. And you think about that and you're like, wow. Or it's just like Stanislaus Zbyszko doing the same thing and knocking guys like Luthez for not being real wrestlers in the 40s and 50s. And Luthez doing the same thing to wrestlers in the 80s. It's like everybody from their generation, well, not everybody, but a lot of people, they knock that next generation. And you could either knock it or you could learn how it works. And I chose, because there was a time when I was disheveled with pro wrestling, the future of pro wrestling. I was like one of those kind of like hard-nosed guys that was like, oh man, I wish it was more like the good old days. But then I kind of like kicked myself in the butt and was like, wait a second, I still like pro wrestling. It's going to be different than it used to be. And it might not be what I loved when I was a kid, but it could be something cool today. And so like I decided to like really do something different. And what we did almost 10 years ago with Defy, we see nationally now with major companies doing the same, running the same model of how they present shows. So it's pretty rewarding, actually.
I've looked through, to prepare here, I looked through all the cards and things, and a little bit more on booking. I've seen, I would book Zack Sabre Jr. versus Timothy Thatcher every show that I could, because I would, today's version of Lynn Shelley versus Bobby Nichols, you know? And it's like, I would never, ever get tired of watching those two guys wrestle. Different Booker's vision. One match you had was Minoru Suzuki versus Joey Janela. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, on paper, I don't know, but maybe it'll be okay.
Yeah.
But
It's really strange. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I know that booking is a lot more than just who will wrestle who. What, speak on those particular matchups, but also what other aspects of booking that a normal fan just doesn't understand.
There's different ways of looking at booking too. There's a difference in booking a monthly card, say Seattle, which is like a monthly event for us, or we've taken a little bit of breaks here and there to cool things down. But like Seattle, for example, if we're running that venue 10 times a year, you book it a little differently than if you were running monthly or weekly. So it's hard to say, but so going into a show where you need to draw a crowd for each event 10 times in the same venue in a year, you think, okay, well, I have to book something just for box office appeal. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to mean anything. Like, it doesn't need to be a complete story from month to month, because this person I might bring in like a Minoru Suzuki for a one-time event, because you can't use him every month. It's too costly. He won't be available. He's a special attraction.
Sure.
So when you bring in a guy like Minoru Suzuki, your whole concept, your whole idea of booking him is to come up with an attraction. I've used him in the past. It's like, first time I used him, I booked him versus Tom Lawler's an ex-UFC fighter. He's got a massive MMA background and experience. He's great to work with, as legitimate as you could come. Well, here's Minoru Suzuki, who's like one of the godfathers of MMA, So that's like a natural fit. These guys are going to beat the shit out of each other, right? So it's like, what a great match. They're just going to beat the hell out of each other, which a lot of fans love. Next time we had Minoru Suzuki out, we had him wrestle somebody else. Then we had him out again, and it's like, here's Joey Janela, who I've used him pretty consistently since 2017. And I know that there's good and bad reps for people. Some people don't like Joey Janela. They make fun of him for whatever, because he does some silly stuff once in a while. Every time I've ever used Joey Janela, he has knocked it out of the park. He has had some of the best matches in the fight. He's also very capable as a wrestler. If you don't believe me, just watch him and Nick Wayne wrestle for an hour.
Sure.
And it's like, his style on paper might not match up to like what a Minoru Suzuki match would, like what you would think in your head.
Right.
But Joey's also like very he's able to adapt to all styles. And he's also like a student of the game. So it's like, he will have a good match with Minoru Suzuki. And it was a really great match. And it drew well, because in fans' minds, they're like, oh, here's this Joey Janela who does a lot of wild stuff. Well, here's a guy who just beats the hell out of people. So that's going to be really cool.
Sure.
So sometimes you book matches like that just because either there's a purpose, they're going to beat the hell out of each other, it's going to be a great match, or this is such a wild match that I would have never thought of. So it's going to be interesting.
Let's see what happens.
Yes, exactly. And so there's always like different ideas that goes into different matches. But yeah, Joey is an interesting character because he's got a reputation. There's people like the Jim Cornettes who just hate him.
Right.
But then there's also people like myself who has had nothing but positive experiences with him. And every time that I've ever used him, whether I use him against a local guy or a national talent, he always over delivers. So it's like, it's one of those weird things. Like, I know like Ed Moretti, for example, super old school guy, but ask him what he thought about Joey Janela versus Nick Wayne. He loved the match from what he told me. It's crazy. Different generations are inspired by different things,
Sure.
So I know Mike has one last question, but I wanted to throw something in here because you mentioned first Ed Moretti, who we just had a great conversation with. If you haven't listened to it, people, you should go out there and listen to it on Ringside in Rose City, available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. But he has really enjoyed AEW because of Nick and that exposure, but also because of Shayna on there. So he's come to understand in their conversations on how wrestling has evolved, and he's come to appreciate that. And you abused and Defy, you mentioned finding local guys that can stand up to the level, the bar that the national guys have. So I think of guys you've used like Ethan HD, Ricky Gibson, and Midnight Heat have really upped their game. And so I think part of that is seeing guys that are working with guys that are at the national level has helped them raise their bar. So that's great for Defy. But one question for you. So you mentioned Nick Wayne. How great was it when Darby Allin and Nick Wayne got together and the contract was signed?
That was tremendous. The behind the scenes of that match was so amazing. This is the honest to goodness shoot. Darby being there and presenting Nick with that contract that night, there were 5 people who knew that Darby was going to be there that night. That was myself. That was my partner, Jim. That was Tony Khan. That was Darby. And then later on that night, Christopher Daniels, who was Nick Wayne's opponent that night. No one else knew that he was going to be there that night. I did give the Iggy to Swerve Strickland because Swerve was also coming back and making a surprise that night as well, too. But Shauna and Nick had no idea.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, Darby did not even come into the building until after Nick went to the ring for his match against Christopher Daniels that night. And Nick's mom went out there to film the match herself. So she was out there watching the match and had no idea that Darby showed up. I gave the Iggy to Christopher Daniels to keep Nick into the ring after their match was over, and so that he wouldn't have rolled out of the ring and went to the back so we could do the thing with Christopher Daniels and Darby. So like for people that are listening, Darby came out as a surprise. Christopher Daniels beat Nick Wayne in the match, was about to attack him after the match. Darby came out as a surprise, beat up Christopher Daniels and sent him to the back. And at that point, Darby Allin presented Nick Wayne with a contract to AEW, which he literally signed that contract to AEW in the dressing room at Defy. And then, of course, we had Darby Allin, Nick Wayne, both in the ring celebrating. That was a very real moment because, as people know, Darby Allin was trained by Nick Wayne's father, and they grew up. Nick grew up with Darby as like an older brother almost. And so they had like a really strong connection with them both. Then that night, just a few seconds later, Swerve Strickland, who had just been released from WWE, was coming there to make another surprise. He came out to the ring, got in Darby's face, who Darby is in AEW at the time. And then Swerve turned his attention to Nick Wayne and got into Nick Wayne's face. And then we had like a year-long feud with Nick Wayne and Shane Strickland. One of the things about Swerve Strickland that a lot of people don't realize is that even when he was working for WWE, he would come to Defy events once in a while and even act as an agent for Defy. And he would specifically work in a lot of Nick's matches just because he saw Nick as somebody who had potential to be a star, which is pretty cool, kind of like a full circle moment.
Now, you mentioned being a star. And Mike, you get to ask your last question here in just a second. But imagine Nick Wayne has no idea that Darby's going to do this and comes in. And so what's the thought going on in his head? And then he kind of catches on with Darby and then Swerve comes out. That has to be something in Nick's head where he understands the business. It's a real natural for him.
Yeah, very much. It is. And Nick, growing up into the business, I used to sneak when Nick was 13, 14 years old. I used to let Nick sneak into the back and work for me as like an errand guy in our dressing room at Defy, just because I wanted him to be in the back and be around all of these guys that were coming in. And so I'd have Nick run errands for me under the guys because it's a 21 and over venue. And as long as he's working, he could legally be allowed to be there in the back. And so I'd have Nick back there with me by the production table a lot of times, just so he could be around some of these stars that are coming in, so he could get exposed to that, which I thought was always a lot of fun for him.
That's very cool.
Yeah. And Nick was always one of those guys where we always saw that potential in him. When Darby came out and presented him the contract, Nick was 16 years old. So he had signed up. It was almost like a developmental promissory contract. And he wasn't able to wrestle for AEW until he turned 18, which was a year and a half later. He had to sit and work the indies for a while still. But even after joining AEW, Nick has been one of the guys that we like to feature when we can.
Wow. Now, where does Defy go from here? I know you have a Portland show coming in April, but how will it continue to grow?
It's all like the independent world right now is again, we're on the cusp of something changing. Pro wrestling's changing right now again. I think there's another wave of independent wrestling coming up soon, where there's going to be a large mass of stars coming up through the system. Right now, one of the things that Defi's we're really motivated to do is go out and seek that next wave of independent stars who will eventually go on and become stars in the larger promotions. But there's a lot of talent right now that we're looking at globally who we feel will have potential to be like that next line of stars. So that's like really where Defi's growth is. All pro wrestling companies, their ability and success is always going to be based around talent and how they present that talent. And so that's one of the things that we are always intrigued by, that next group of talent that we can help grow to that next level.
Matt, this has been a fantastic conversation. On this show, Mike and I spend a lot of time digging into Portland wrestling history. We talk wrestlers, the cards, the arenas, the spot shows, the moments that we think made the territory special. And tonight, it was great having someone with your depth of knowledge and insight into the business to join us and talk about wrestling history. And honestly, I know this will make Mike's head even bigger. This is one of my favorite shows, listening to you two talk about the insights of inside parts of pro wrestling and what makes it special for all of us. And we know that you were digging through microfilm when you were much younger, as you said, old newspaper archives that still have Mike Rogers. As he talked about dropping out of college. I don't think we covered that in Books, Balls, and Squirrel Paws, the story of Mike Rogers and the education. I think we're going to have to redo that. But yeah, I appreciate you helping preserve stories of Buddy Rose and Roddy Piper, although you didn't mention the Roddy Piper with the lighter in the bathroom with Brian Alvarez story, but that's another time.
Yes.
You help shine a light on the Northwest wrestling scene today through Defy, and you're someone who really understands both where wrestling has been and obviously where it's going. So, Mike, any final words for Matt Farmer?
I appreciate you so much, Matt. It's always great talking history with you. And to be honest, I'm really proud of this show that we just did. I feel like it's a show that I would want to listen to if I were a wrestling fan of current time, of past time. And I think we delved into some really interesting topics.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it. Mike, I really appreciate Mike a lot. Frank, you too. There's just so much to it. I miss those days of going to Smokey's Pizza after Portland or the Portland Sports Arena shows, Mike. Those were a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mike was like one of the first guys that really exposed me to like the inside of wrestling, like really learning. Like, I think I met Mike before I like found my first Observer, for example, so yeah.
And I'm going to guess that Mike never picked up the check at those pizza parlors, did he?
I don't remember, honestly. I'm sure we all each paid for ourselves. I was working at the time, and Mike was young too. I mean, a lot older than I was. I don't know what Mike was doing hanging around with a bunch of teenagers, though.
We've covered that in the court documents, so we're not going to talk about it.
To be fair, we were probably 17, 18 around that time. So we were almost adults.
Oh. Well, we appreciate you being on here. And Lisa, I want to thank you for keeping the wheel spinning and keeping the envelopes spinning around that wheel and for bringing me the drinks during the show. And Mike, she tried to get to you a couple of times, but you were talking, so no drinks for you again today. But Lisa's doing a good job. Matt, can you tell us about the upcoming Defy match that Mike mentioned that you have at the Hawthorne Theater?
I invite everybody to our Defy show in Portland, Friday, April 10th at the Hawthorne Theater. We've got a contingent of wrestlers from the Dragon Gate promotion from Japan. We've got 11 wrestlers from Japan coming over that night. We also have Marina Shafir, who is the Defy World's Champion, and she's also got a big match this weekend at AEW Revolution. We also have our Defy World Champion, Bounty Hunter Brian Keith, who also has a big match with AEW this weekend as well. They're both going to be there that night. They're going to be defending their world championships. And like I said, some of the biggest stars from Dragon Gate Wrestling from Japan will be in action that night at the Hawthorne Theater.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us here on Ringside in Rose City as we keep telling the stories of the wrestlers, the arenas, and the fans who made Portland Wrestling special. Remember to subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasting fix. Mike and I appreciate you subscribing, and new episodes drop every Thursday. So until next time, I'm Frank Culbertson alongside
Mike Rogers.
And this has been Ringside in Rose City. Wrestling the way it should be. Lisa, take us home.
And that's a wrap from Ringside in Rose City, where one ring, one city, and 1,000 stories never fail to deliver. I'm Lisa Hughes, and this has been a Yaski production. Catch every episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your wrestling fix. Until next time, keep your boots laced, your popcorn buttered, and your stories ready.